Chapter 3 has two main events that I want to highlight in this brief chapter review or summary. Okay. The first being Bacon's Rebellion, and the second one being a philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment. Okay. First, Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion takes place from 1675 to 1676. So in the very early years of the British American colonies, in present day Virginia. Okay. So in a nutshell, what you have with Bacon's Rebellion is you have this. You have the landed aristocracy that were the original settlers into Jamestown, into what would become the colony of Virginia. They had used primarily indentured servitude as their primary form of labor to cultivate their cash crops like tobacco. Okay. By 1675, you now had a generation of indentured servants that were now demanding access to land and thus demanding access to social, political, and economic equality to the men that had once been their quote unquote masters when they were indentured servants. So you have this guy, Nathaniel Bacon. He leads an uprising of these former indentured servants, and they march to the Capitol in Jamestown and the House of Burgesses, the government agents' house, and they demand that the government pay for the removal of Native American tribes living on the frontier so that they can gain access to that land. The government, of course, refused, and Bacon and his followers rose up and burnt the Capitol to the ground and the city to the ground and demanded access to land, which would allow them the right to vote, the right to move up the economic and social ladder and become the equals to their white male counterparts that they had once worked for, that had paid for their journey over to what is today America. What happens in Bacon's Rebellion? Well, the rebellion fizzles out after they burn the Capitol down, primarily because Nathaniel Bacon dies of disease. And the old aristocracy comes back into Virginia, and they sit down and they say, we've got a problem. We need cheap labor to be able to cultivate these cash crops. But these indentured servants, once they become free of the contract, they're demanding to become our equals. How can we find a group of cheap, affordable labor that can do the work in the tobacco fields and not one day become free and demand equality to us? And of course, this is the significant moment in American history where the American South will start to significantly turn towards the Middle Passage and the importation of Africans into chattel slavery. And that's why Nathaniel Bacon and his rebellion are so critical. And it's sometimes one of those unintended consequences of history. That's certainly not what Nathaniel Bacon and his followers had in mind. They wanted the right to become equal to their other white counterparts. But in fact, the result of their rebellion leads to the growth of the institution of slavery throughout the United States, which is a tragic unintended outcome. The second main focus of this chapter is the Enlightenment, which is this philosophical movement that takes place over in Europe in the 1600s and makes its way over to what would become the United States, the British North American colonies in the late early 1700s. The Enlightenment has a couple major things that are going to impact the American founding, and these are the things that I'm going to highlight in this short review. The first being rationalism. So one of the first things that comes out of the Enlightenment is rationalism, starting to look at the world with reason, using statistics, empirical evidence to decipher and understand the world around you. Easy example. Lightning and thunder are not God is angry. It is a scientific phenomenon which can be measured and predicted, right? We know that the weather is predictable, right? And that it's not some sort of deity or godlike creature saying I'm angry, right? Or when it rains, it's not God crying, right? So that's the first thing, is this sort of rationalism, which also plays into sort of this idea that, is it rational? Does it make sense for a person who's imperfect, a king, a queen, whoever, to have absolute power, to be able to rule over a nation and rule over sometimes millions and hundreds of millions of people and not have restrictions or checks upon their authority or their decision making, right? Is that rational? Not really, right? Is it rational just because someone's born into a family that they should be the next in line to rule? Not really, right? So you have rational. That's a really important part of the Enlightenment that sort of lays the foundation for some of the other main ideas, right? So one of the other main ideas here is that you have the idea of republicanism. So this plays on the sort of rejection of monarchies, rejection of divine right rulers, authoritarian, dictatorial, tyrannical, despotic rulers that we would think of today, right? So this idea of republicanism, not the party, the Republican Party, but the concept of republicanism, is that governments only have the authority to govern when the people consent to it, when they give them permission, when they allow them to. We do it by voting, right? and that those individuals that we choose to be our government represent us and make decisions on our best behalf, right? Um, so think of it like you elect someone, they make decisions on your behalf, and then they don't do a good job. Well, then you remove consent and you can vote them out. Building upon republicanism is the concept of popular sovereignty, which is another thing that came out of the Enlightenment. Popular sovereignty being that, roughly translated, means the people's will, right? So that the people get to make decisions, they are the source of power and authority. Again, this ties right into republicanism, right? So you have republicanism, this concept that you choose people to represent you and make decisions on your behalf. And then again, is that the people are the source of that power, popular sovereignty, okay? Now, this concept of popular sovereignty is similar to the concept of democracy, but not really. Okay, and what we'll see later in this course is that you'll see the idea of popular sovereignty come to fruition in the 1850s when dealing with should a territory that's about to become a state have slavery or not. And this was the great idea of Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois, was let's just let the people pick. They vote, they decide if they want to have slavery or not, and that's popular sovereignty. That's democracy, right? Even though their elected officials couldn't make decisions about those things. And of course, as you could predict, when regular people made decisions like this, it led to violence, right? And we see that in a series of events known as Bleeding Kansas, but that comes later in this course, later in a much later chapter. The final concept of enlightenment that we'll talk about here that's built into this founding of the United States that's so critical is the idea of constitutionalism. And I know we have a constitution today in this country, but the concept of constitutionalism is similar but different. Again, the founders were brilliant, but they weren't necessarily all the time that creative. They named our governing document the Constitution based on the principle of constitutionalism, right? So what is constitutionalism? Is that government should be bound to the people by contracts, and those contracts should be transparent and public, meaning we know what powers the government has and what ones they don't, right? So when you look at Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, it's the powers of the legislature. Theoretically, if it's not a power in there, they can't do it, right? Article 2, the power of the executive, the power of the presidency. Theoretically, in a perfect world, if it's not listed in there under the powers of the president, they can't do it. And we know that because we have the Constitution. And so we are able to check the government by saying, hey, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. So that's that idea of constitutionalism, is that government should be bound by contracts that are open and transparent and public, right? And a lot of these things today, we just sort of look at them and go, well, yeah, no kidding, duh. Well, somebody had to come up with them, and then they had to be adopted in what would become the United States, right? Finally is the idea of natural rights, okay? Natural rights was the idea of this Enlightenment thinker by the name of John Locke, Locke. He was an Englishman, and he came up with the natural rights theory. Sometimes you might see it called social contract theory. It's really quite simple, okay? He says all human beings are born equal. Not that they're the same, but they're born, that they're given by their creator, whoever that may be, natural rights, life, liberty, and the right to own property, okay? So life, that's pretty easy. You have the right to be alive, and someone shouldn't be able to take that away from you, right? You have the right to liberty, free will, freedom. Nobody should be able to take away your right to choose what you want to do, where you want to live, right? And then finally, the right to own property. And this is groundbreaking. Think back to what I talked about Bacon's Rebellion. Why was owning property, why was owning land such a big deal to these men? Because owning land meant you could make money off of that land. You could be your own boss. You could make money. You could go from poor to middle class to rich. You could pursue your own happiness. And again, that is what the Americans call it in the Declaration of Independence. The pursuit of happiness is tied to property ownership, meaning the ability to better yourself. You could not do that without owning your own property. And then also the second part of owning property is critical to this idea that if you don't have property, you don't have land, you couldn't vote. This was a requirement during this time. And so if you couldn't vote, you couldn't be involved in politics, you couldn't say who's your government, therefore you could not be happy, right? So these were critical things that John Locke came up with, saying everybody's born with these rights. So again, life, liberty, and the right to own property. He didn't say everybody gets property. Okay? He said everybody has the right to own property, meaning if you work hard and you get lucky and breaks go your way and you save your money, you can buy that house, you can buy that land, you can start that business, right? And then you can work hard and pursue your happiness. That's what he was saying. And then the second thing that he says about this that's so critical is he says, so everybody's born with this, right? Whether you're born at the bottom or born at the top, okay? So everybody's equal with those natural rights. And so then he says, what is the role of government in this world that everybody has these natural rights? And he said, the role of government is to protect the people's natural rights. And so your government is doing its job when your life, your freedom, and your right to pursue your happiness are being protected. There we go, right? What do you do when a government doesn't do that? You replace it. Very simple. How do you replace a king? Well, you probably have to overthrow them violently, right? How do you replace a government in this country today that isn't doing its job? You vote them out. And so that's where you sort of see through these principles of natural rights theory, constitutionalism, popular sovereignty, republicanism, and rationalism. These are ideas that are revolutionary for their time, but they're all foundational in what would become the United States of America. Finally, if you've sat through this entire video, thank you. I appreciate that. And what I would like to offer you is 10 points extra credit on your first paper. If at the end of your paper, you simply give me a 2 to 3 sentence reflection upon which of the natural rights that I just talked about you feel is the most important. Or I'll give you a second option. Or maybe if you do both, you can get 20 points. Okay. Which of the Enlightenment principles do you feel is the most impactful today in the United States? Because they are all a part of the United States today. Okay. Thank you.